So, how many of you have had that experience? You're about to learn something new, something a little challenging, and someone says, there's nothing to it. It's like riding a bicycle. How many of you remember riding the bicycle for the first time? Now, some of you taught yourself, and I didn't. My father taught me, and I even had training wheels, but still I fell. Even with the training wheels, it was a Stingray. I invite you to go check out, I wrote about it in a blog post this past week. I invite you to go check out the whole story about that. What I want to suggest to you, though, is that life is not like riding a bicycle. That, in fact, most of us are not so sage-like and mystical that we can sort of glide balanced and easily through life day after day. There's always something that's going to trip us up. And the medieval monks, when they were asked how they would practice their faith, they often replied, "We learn by falling down and getting up." It's pretty much how life is. I think it was Einstein. Well, did we already pass the Einstein quote? Yeah. What was that Einstein said? Because my father had said this to me too. Life's like riding a bike. To stay in balance, you have to keep moving. Again, not always the case. Depending on where our fault lines are and where we've laid them for ourselves, we might keep moving, but we're not always paying attention. We're not always aware of our own booby traps, our own self-sabotage, and sometimes moving can be almost the worst thing we can do. I want to suggest what Joseph Campbell had said. I want to read something from his collection. Let's see where this went. This was from Diane Osborne, who had an interview with him and called Reflections on the Art of Living, a Joseph Campbell Companion. I just stumbled on this because I was looking at this text from the Gospel of Matthew. And then I realized after looking at the song that Brad and I had picked out at the beginning of the week, again, the song speaks so much to this text as well. Campbell says, it's by going down. It is by going down into the abyss that we recover the treasures of life. Where you stumble, there lies your treasure. The very cave you are afraid to enter turns out to be the source of what you are looking for. That thing in the cave that was so dreaded has now become the center, and you find the jewel, and it draws you off. In loving the mystery, you cannot despise the earthly. I think life is a lot like falling down, and it's a lot like getting up. It's a lot like remembering, and it's a lot like forgetting. And you know those moments where you've forgotten something for years. A good friend of mine, well, a good acquaintance of mine, a storyteller up in Chicago, an amazing man by the name of Sid Lieberman, passed away this past week. I hadn't been in touch with him for a couple of years. We had lunch when I was up there a few years back, he and some other friends. One of these core individuals in sort of the renaissance of storytelling back in the 80s. That had had such an influence across the nation, even worked with NASA and some of its narrative development and helping them create a story that sort of branded who they are. Sid Lieberman was an amazing Jewish person that loved story and myth. And as I was thinking about Sid Lieberman, I began to remember. Isn't that what we do? When we start thinking, when something triggers something in our minds, we begin to remember. We don't always remember exactly how it happened either. But what we do remember starts to pull pieces together. We piece our lives together, I think, by forgetting and remembering, by falling and by getting back up. The gospel refers to it this way, that the kingdom is like someone walking in or trespassing. It wasn't their field. They were walking in someone else's field and then stumbling on a treasure. It's sort of something that you commit to once you discover it, but it's not a once and all for all reality. The reality is that we're up and we're down, and the challenge is not getting stuck in where we fall. Mark Nepo, I don't know if you all have read Mark Nepo. Mark Nepo is a wonderful writer and a very deep and spiritual writer. I encourage you to check him out some. But he writes that sometimes this valley is a place of self-loathing. Sometimes this valley is a place of fault-finding. It can be fault-finding with ourselves. I, myself, am very familiar with this valley. It's easy, I think, sometimes to criticize ourselves, to constantly remind ourselves that we haven't matched up or we haven't met up to our expectations. And if it's not there, then it's easy for us to find fault with others and carry it around like a familiar backpack. We get painfully stalled because of our fault finding. That gap between who we think we are to be and who we think we actually are. And it's somewhat like a geological kind of relationship when you think about it. We do create fault lines. And as Joseph Campbell would suggest, the only way we really get in touch with those fault lines that we have laid ourselves is to begin to embrace them. So I want to talk with you about just three examples of how we fall. I suspect some of you can identify with some of them. I know I identify with all of them. The first one's a familiar one because I want to talk with you about Saul. Saul, Paul the apostle. Saul of Tarsus. Very simple story. Many of you might know this story. Saul was a Jew born in the year 3 A.D. thereabouts, born in Jerusalem, raised in a Pharisaic family, raised in a very strict law-abiding Jewish family. By the time the Christian communities were coming along, Saul made his point and purpose to persecute and to arrest and imprison and even kill Christians. He was an avid hunter of Christians. And then he has that familiar experience. On the road to Damascus, he's suddenly struck dumb, as the scripture it says, by the one whom he had pursued. He is struck blind and no longer can see by the very one he was persecuting. A way of thinking about this personally might be he was struck blind and suddenly by the very prejudice that motivated and moved his life. In a sense, you might say that his falling was caused externally. But if we think of our own things that we hang on to, our own biases that we hang on to, our own stories that we carry around about ourselves that influence and prejudice how we feel about ourselves, much less how we feel about others, if we think about that, it's not happening externally. Perhaps it finally comes that the fault line has grown so wide and so unavoidable that we too are struck blinded by our own bias. We're forced to see with the eyes of the very bias that we hold. And in doing that, perhaps there's an opportunity for transformation. Because for Paul, of course, it transformed the way in which he looked at everyone around him. Anyone who's been knocked off their high horse and who's welcomed it, that's the key, right? But anyone who's been knocked off their high horse and welcomed the sudden imbalance, surely they recognize, as you might have experienced yourself, you recognize seeing the world in a new way. And you discover at our hearts, we're all the same. There's another way in which we fall, and this is what I call the flat-out self-induced one. You can go back to that picture now. Yeah, this is just a metaphor, but I'll give you the scenario. You might have done this. I'm guilty of this all the time. I have a deep story in the back of my head that reminds me that in order to do something, I have to prove myself. Sometimes it's with the simplest things like I'm leaving Central Market and the person is behind the counter, and I look at her and I say, "No worries, I can bag my own groceries." And I begin to bag the groceries. And she looks at me and she says, "Well, you might need some more groceries." And I'm thinking, no, because I can carry all of these groceries if I bag them just right. And then I see the people standing around me. And I'm not egotistical, I won't say that. But at the same time, I'm thinking I can show people just how well that if you really plan ahead, if you're really organized, or as I was told in Germany when I was visiting there and didn't bring my bag, and the guy says, "Well, maybe you brought change, but you didn't plan," because you're supposed to bring your own bags when you go shopping in Germany. I had that same sense of which, if you plan ahead, if you get everything organized, it will work. And soon enough, I'm picking up the groceries, 2 bags in one hand, a 6-pack of that bottled water in the other hand, and then balancing another little item on my finger with a little strap there. I've got all of these things, and I walk out the door opens, and someone says something, and the bag rips. Right? Surely some of you have been there. Like my son trying to show me just how well he can balance the bucket of paint and the paintbrush on the 5th step of the ladder. And it all comes crashing down as he tries to turn and keep that balance. The reality is we have a lot of self-induced falls. We try to balance a lot of things in our life. We try to balance a lot of our opinions, a lot of the stories that we feel compelled to project about ourselves. And sometimes those compelling stories, in order to keep them balanced, have to have more stories that support that. And then the criticisms that continue to support those that need to support those stories we tell. Perhaps we're trying to balance too many things in our life in so many different ways. Perhaps it's the pains that we experience. Sometimes it's difficult to get through the door when you're trying to balance it all. I've told that story in here before about the man from Crete. The fellow, the one Cretan story. In fact, I first learned it from Sid Lieberman a long time ago. But this story, simply, the short version of it, was that the man in Crete, Crete's an island south of Greece, he was so proud of his country. The whole country centered around its pride, its sense of community and identity. He was so proud of that when he died, he swore that no one around him, he made everyone around him swear that they would not force him to let go of the soil that he wanted to be buried with. So he clung to some soil in his fist. He died, and they placed him in the casket, his hand clenching still to the soil. Rigor mortis, just fist clenching it. In heaven, as the story goes, when he got to the gates, Peter was there, wouldn't let him in. Peter said, "You can't come in here. You're holding on to stuff. You can't come in if you keep holding on to stuff." He couldn't let go of it because it was too important. What in your life is so important that you can't let go of? What fault lines even have become so important that for some reason we can't even let go of those stories, even if they're self-sabotaging, even when they're self-destructive? How hard it is for us to let go of all of that. And so for eons, it says that this fellow would not let go of it. He watched people pass by. Some of his drinking buddies came out and said, we got a great bar in here, it could be a lot of fun if you just let go of that. And he's like, no, this is my identity. I am not letting go of this is me. I'm not letting go. And he stayed out there. Then his granddaughter, finally, eons later, granddaughter comes out, little girl, she comes out and she smiles at him and she says, please come in. And he's overwrought with just this wonderful sense of emotion. Just a moment of lapsing, he weakens his grip. Instead, she reaches in and grabs the hand, and the two of them walk through the gate. And of course, the first thing he sees on the other side is his island of Crete. And isn't that the way of it? Isn't that the treasure so often along those fault lines that we so delicately try to balance, that we try to keep in line, that we cling to? In reality, the holy in our midst, the eternal in our midst, is constantly reminding us to let go a little bit so that we might experience even the deeper joy, even in the most difficult moments. Show that next picture up there, if you can, Austin. Anybody recognize this? No? Kimball Art Museum aficionados? This is this near, I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, Sydenham Hill, which is a suburb of South London, back in the mid-1800s. It's painted by the Impressionist painter Camille Pissarro. It's on one of the permanent collections at the Kimball. When I saw this painting, my wife's a huge fan of Impressionist art, and I've become a little bit more so over the years because she loves to go. When the Bass collection was there, they had this wonderful portion of it that was all about Impressionist, post-Impressionist artists, and so we just spent hours there in the exhibit just walking around. But I was fascinated with the story about Pissarro that came before this painting. He grew up in France, but he grew up during the Franco-Prussian War. And it was during that war that he was forced to leave. He was approximately 40 years of age. He had stayed to the very last because for 30 years he had painted as many as 1,500 canvases. And he kept them all around him in his barn. And he wouldn't leave. He was finally forced to leave as the Prussian soldiers were overtaking his village. And he left everything. He had to get out of there for his life. When he finally came back about 7 months later, after having lived in London, the whole village was decimated. The barn had been burned down. There were soldiers that had been using his canvases as floor mats, as cloths. There was apparently a local farm worker who was actually washing out blood with one of his canvases, he says in his narrative. Just imagine 1,500 of your creations completely destroyed. There were something like 30 pieces left. According to the stories, it devastated him, but he went back to London and began to find other people who loved art like himself, who pursued art, because it was very questionable for his period. So he ended up running into Cézanne, he ended up running into Manet, he ended up making friends with Van Gogh, and pretty soon he founded the first Impressionistic Society. And at the age of 42 began painting again. And what we have now are the last 30 years of Pissarro's life. But the one thing that story taught me, like so many people that I've met over the years and so many encounters I've had, some of you in here and some with my work at camps, at some point, people who experience such loss realize that these kind of falls are opportunities because they've learned that all of life is always a beginning. All of life is always a new beginning. So I want to give this thought here for a conclusion. I ran across, I know we read a lot of Mary Oliver in here. And I found this poem in one of her collections that I had not read before, and I thought it just speaks to this so well, so nicely. There are many ways to perish or to flourish. How old pain, for example, can stall us at the threshold of function. Still, friends, consider stone that is without the fret of gravity. Consider water that is without anxiety. And the pine trees that never forget their recipe for renewal, and the female wood duck who is looking this way and that way for her children, and the snapping turtle who is also looking this way and that way. Consider always, every day, the determination of the grass which grows despite its unending obstacles. I'd like to think sometimes that I'm a Stoic. I've actually wrestled with that many times. I've had in the back of my mind this sort of Stoic philosophy, this almost Zen-like suffering is attachment. If we don't hold on to the judgments aren't there. If we see the suffering as not suffering, the suffering isn't there. But my heart, if I'm honest with myself, my heart tells me that's simply trying to dance around the fault lines. That in reality, sometimes the only way to truly learn from falling is by embracing and loving our way through it. I invite the band to get ready as I make this last suggestion. There are many ways to fall. The harder practice is getting up. At the heart of all of our fault lines and the places where we often fall, there is still, if we're willing to settle, if we're willing to lean in to the curve, so to speak, if we're willing to rest with the vibrations that sometimes shake our foundations, there still an ever-present quiet voice that speaks beneath the pain or our self-doubt or our fault lines, and even in our failed sense of dreaming. A voice that suggests that if we pay attention to where we stumble, we will discover that the best chance to be whole is to love whatever gets in the way. And when we learn to do that, we begin not just to fill the fault lines with that sense of love, but the world around us.